Welcome to Balkans Debrief. My name is Ilva Tare. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. In a landmark deal, Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni have established the Migrant Processing Center in Albania. Funded by Italy and operating under Italian jurisdiction, the center will process asylum seekers rescued by Italian vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. The center, expected to open in spring 2024, will have a maximum capacity of 3,000 migrants per month and is expected to operate for at least 1 to 5 years. Migrants will remain in Albania under their asylum claims are evaluated until they are evaluated, and upon completion of the process, Italy will facilitate their departure from Albania. Now, this agreement has sparked intense reactions. While the European Commission has stated that the deal does not breach the EU asylum law, Amnesty International and other human rights groups have labeled it as illegal and unworkable, drawing parallels to the British government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, which was deemed illegal by a UK Supreme Court. The Italy-Albania agreement has sparked criticism mainly, as I said, among human rights groups. Prime Minister of Albania has outlined that this agreement represents an act of solidarity and reaffirms Albania's commitment to the EU membership. To discuss all this, my guest today is Natalie Tocci, the director of Instituto Affari Internazionali.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ilva.
Given the political and legal complexities surrounding this agreement, what is your overall assessment of this? What are your thoughts? Do you have any concerns about implications?
Well, I mean, yes, I absolutely do have many concerns, but perhaps let me start off by saying that on the Italian side, and then perhaps we can discuss, on the Albanian side, but on the Italian side, this has been mainly a PR stunt, frankly speaking. As we know, we're in a situation in which migration flows are basically back at the levels that they were at in 2015, 2016, when everyone was only talking about the migration crisis. Now, of course, we have a war in Ukraine, we have a war in the Middle East. I mean, we have other issues. And so perhaps also for that reason, we're not talking about migration just as much as we did back then. However, in terms, as I said, of the sheer numbers, basically this is where we're at. Now, here we are in Italy with a government that, back in the days 2015, 2016, all it was talking about was an invasion of migrants. And of course, if only it was in power, it would have, the solution to the problem. It would conduct a naval blockade in the Mediterranean and, everything would be just fine. And of course, now it is in government, and the sort of fanciful solutions that it had imagined when it was in opposition are obviously not available. And so at the same time, this is a right-wing government that has been now in power for over a year, and those numbers are climbing up. So it is at the very least an embarrassment. So Meloni basically has needed something for quite some time. She tried with Tunisia. And that didn't turn out too well, right? I mean, she went to Tunisia. She basically tried, she successfully persuaded the European Commission to provide financial assistance to Tunisia. And of course, the deal in the memorandum of understanding with Tunisia is that Kais Saied would actually keep migrants in Tunisia. And Kais Saied, that is in fact even more racist than the most racist politician in Europe, has basically said, well, you know what, you can keep your money, yeah? We're not going to keep your migrants. And so Tunisia didn't work out too well. And, as we know, Giorgia Meloni has actually developed an actually quite strong relationship with Edi Rama in Albania.
Without meaning to interrupt you, Natalie, all the prime minister of Italy have had these close relationships with Albanian prime minister. Is that the case or not?
It is. I think she's made more of an issue of this. She went on holiday to Albania in the summer, and it was a holiday that, although she tried to cover it up as a sort of private family thing, she then very deliberately publicized it actually quite a lot, and really trying to emphasize this personal bond, basically, between herself and Rama. So whereas, yes, I would say that on a whole, all previous governments, regardless of who there was in Albania, I mean, there has been Edi Rama really for quite some time, but they have, sort of emphasized that bilateral relationship. But I think she has gone a step beyond. And so in a situation in which, as I said, she was really looking for something to show for, because perhaps another aspect that I should emphasize is that not only did the Tunisia leg of a potential strategy fail, but the internal EU dimension has also failed. And it's failed because Giorgia Meloni's friends, beginning with Viktor Orban, are not having any of this, right? I mean, they don't want to basically share the responsibility on migration. And so she turned to Rama as her savior, right? And this deal is basically, I think, embedded into this broader political context. Now, am I concerned about it? Legally, basically here you have, and the Commission has recently come out on this, essentially saying, well, it could actually end up being legal, because to the extent that, and here there is a difference between, for instance, the Italy-Albania agreement as opposed to, for instance, the UK-Rwanda agreement. In the case of Italy-Albania, it is actually clarified that the law that would apply in the centres would be Italian law, i.e. it would be EU law. So in principle, the norms and procedures should be followed. So I'm slightly less worried, and perhaps I say this because I'm not a lawyer by training, I'm slightly less worried about the actual legal implications. I'm more worried about, in a sense, the practical implications. And what I mean by this is, beyond the fact that actually I don't think that there's going to be a great deal of an effect, because what's going to happen? You have basically up to 30,000 people, and perhaps we should also bear in mind that the numbers just for this year in Italy are over 220,000. Yeah, so we are actually talking about a fairly small proportion of a yearly flow. But of those 30,000 people, let us say that about, 5%, 7% will actually have their asylum application accepted. And presumably these people would then be accepted as asylum seekers in Italy, and they would then be free to move on to other countries as well. Now, what about the ones that are rejected? Now, the ones that are rejected, in principle, they should go back home. But of course, as we know, they do not go back home, right? And so probably what they would end up doing is what they would have done in any case. Some would go to Italy. Some would go to other EU member countries. We know
illegally.
that...
You mean they will go illegally by...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what would have happened had they come to Italy in the first place, right? So I don't actually see much of a practical effect. So you could then say, well, then why are you concerned? I'm concerned because this is a method that you then see other member countries trying to replicate. I mean, I've been quite struck by the way in which, for instance, Germany has actually looked at this agreement rather favorably. So there is a risk, basically, of other countries following a method that
using this as a model,
as a model that both is both legally, at the very least dubious. I mean, perhaps not illegal, but at very least dubious, and practically completely ineffective.
Exactly. I want to mention actually what German Chancellor Scholz has expressed interest in examining this Italy-Albania deal closely, suggesting that it could influence the EU broader approach to migration. Do you think there is more into this, not just a declaration from Chancellor Scholz? Can this be turned into EU policy for the future?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it already is EU policy. I think the danger is, rather than this becoming EU policy, it's the danger that migration increasingly becomes a bilateralized policy. What I mean by this is that already since the 1990s, what has the dynamic been? Late 1990s, early 2000s, the migration dynamic in Europe has basically been one in which Europeans have been unable to agree with each other on how to handle migration internally, and so they have tried to offload the problem externally. It's very easy to meet around the European Council and everyone agrees with the fact that it's someone else that's not in the room that should be dealing with this issue. It's the easiest agreement to have. Of course, the problem is that you don't have the counterparts sitting around the table. And so, in a sense, there have been, with the one exception, which is Turkey, which is the only quote unquote effective example of in a sense, an offloading model. But all other cases that have been tried, I was mentioning earlier, Tunisia, we can talk about Libya, literally no other case has worked, right? And I don't think that the Albania case, for the reasons that I was mentioning earlier, is going to work either. So I think that on the one hand, there is a risk of a solution which has been tried before. And you will recall Einstein's definition of madness, which is basically trying the same thing over and over again and assuming that it will lead to a different result. So on the one hand, there's a question of effectiveness, but then there's also the risk of bilateralizing an ineffective approach. So basically, Meloni having her agreement with Rama, Germany maybe trying to forge an agreement with I don't know whom, and France likewise. And so the risk is that an already fragmented European dynamic on migration actually would end up being even more divisive and fragmented.
Considering all these political sensitivities and not only, also legal complexities surrounding the agreement, how likely do you think is to secure approval from the Italian parliament, this agreement, and how likely you think it will be implemented?
Well, I think it's very likely that it's going to pass. I mean, of course, Meloni has a very solid majority in Parliament, in both houses, and let's also not forget. Not that I think that they would necessarily vote in favor, but let's not also forget that there is one opposition party, in particular the Five Star Movement, that is actually, being a populist party, although it's on the left, it has actually taken a very hard line on migration in the past. You will recall that the Five Star movement was in government with Matteo Salvini's League only a few years ago. And this was really the time in which, Italy was kind of trying to stop NGO boats at sea. So in a sense, with the exception of the Democrat Party that would be staunchly against this agreement, basically either because it's government parties in favor or it's because it's opposition parties that are actually deep down in favor as well, I don't foresee a lot of opposition. Nor do I see many problems in the actual implementation. So yes, I do think that there will be something by perhaps not the spring of next year, fully operational, but Meloni needs to show something. Yeah, she needs to show, especially also, let's not forget that in June, there are European elections, which are really going to be her first electoral test, right? After by then, a year and a half in government. And as I said, all this is happening at a time in which migration is going up. We know that at the moment, because we're in winter, the flows have gone down a bit. But it's a sure thing that by the time that we get to next spring, those numbers are going to start climbing up again. So I think it will be an absolute priority for her, at least to show. It doesn't mean that it's going, as I said, it doesn't mean that it's going to be fully operational or effective, but she needs to have a picture that basically kind of shows that there is something there.
You started this our conversation, Natalie, by saying that this has been mostly a PR stunt from Meloni's side. How do you think this agreement might influence her political standing within Italy and the European Union?
Well, I think it's a good question because, in a sense, the surprising thing up until now is that although she has been not necessarily actually because of her fault, yeah, but the truth is that on her criteria, curbing migration, she's been an utter failure, right? And presumably according also to the criterion used by many of her voters. And yet, it hasn't dented so far significantly her support. Yes, you can see that curve that, it was going up and then it flattened out, and maybe now it's slightly going down, but it hasn't gone down significantly. And I think it's an interesting question why that's the case. Now, I think it partly has to do, in fact, it largely has to do with the fact that she has occupied the media space really rather effectively. And so, as I was saying earlier, there isn't a lot of talk about migration. Migration is actually not talked about in Italy. It would have been talked about had these parties been in opposition, but it's not being talked about, right? So I think that has a big part to do with the story. And I think, sort of pairing off with that is the fact that the opposition has not been very effective in talking about this issue. Now, of course, I could see the difficulty, because you don't want a centre-left, liberal opposition to basically use right-wing arguments to attack a right-wing government. So you can see the difficulty there. But the truth is that the left hasn't capitalized on a blatant failure of the right.
I get it. I have one more question before I ask you about this agreement in the end. Who benefits more? But before we go there, Albanian Prime Minister has attributed the criticism that the agreement has received mainly from the human rights point of view, or the fact that Albania is a non-EU member. Why would they go there? As prejudice. That's how he has called this criticism. Do you believe that the criticism is rooted into the prejudice that the country chosen for the asylum seekers to be sent is Albania?
No, to be honest, actually, I don't think that there's prejudice. I think that Albania was chosen for the simple reason that Italy needed someone, and Albania was, an obvious candidate. I think that those human rights groups criticize not Albania qua Albania, but they criticize the concept of offloading responsibility for asylum processing to a third country. Whatever neighbor it would have been, I think it would have been criticized, because the truth is that the political intent of offloading responsibility is actually preventing asylum seekers coming to Europe. And those human rights groups obviously consider this to be a right to be defended. So I think, what they're criticizing is not Albania. They're criticizing the fact that actually, slowly but surely, Europe, in different forms, and this is just another one of them, is walking back from its commitments under international law.
And who benefits out of this agreement? Do immigrants, the asylum seekers, maybe the procedures will be faster for them to get an answer if their asylum is accepted or not? Or Albania or Italy, as we talked about, Prime Minister Meloni? What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, Meloni benefits to the extent that she's managed to, she will manage to take a few pictures. And so to the extent that the Italian public is gullible, that could be considered a success. I think the real winner is actually Edi Rama. I think that he has, he did her a big favor. And, as Keynes used to say, there is no such thing as a free lunch.
I wonder what was the favor? What comes
exactly.
after the favor?
I don't know. I want to hope that the favor has something to do with, the actual opening of accession negotiations with Albania. So a favor that is worth asking, but I shall not delve more into that because I don't know. But there are good favors to ask, and that would be one of them, of course. But I think he is actually substantively, so, in terms of PR, yes, she may win. Substantively, I think that he is the one that wins. I don't think this is going to make a huge amount of difference to asylum seekers themselves, which were in a bad place before, and they will continue to be in a bad place now.
And the entire immigration issue that the Europe
nowhere near being solved,
will
exactly.
not be addressed or find a potential solution for the future.
Exactly.
Natalie, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing your views with Balkans Debrief, and thank you for watching us.
Thank you.